You're listening to the special sponsors-only extended edition of MF Galaxy. This is MF Galaxy, your weekly webcast of writers on writing, pop culture, politics, and Afrocentricity. Featuring your host, the political, poetical, transformational, sensational, sinister Minister Faust. Webcast around the world from MinisterFaust.com and MFGalaxy.org. On today's episode,
the idea grew up that Northern European people were the most superior people. Now, before that, you go back to the texts of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, who, of course, are Mediterranean peoples. They had precisely the opposite notion, that they thought they, of course, were the most superior ones, and they saw the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, quote-unquote, Aryan types who lived up north as being quite barbaric, which, in fact, they were during that era. And they saw the African people who lived to the south as being extremely intelligent and sophisticated. And they discussed this gradation of mankind. Several of the different authors, Aristotle is one, Vitruvius is another, and they're quite consistent about it, where they say the Northern Europeans are barbarous, savage, stupid people, the Africans are intelligent, sophisticated people, and we, meaning the Mediterranean people right in between, they somehow imply that they have the best qualities of both. They're strong and warlike, but they're also intelligent, and therefore they're the best.
That's Richard Poe, author of Black Spark, White Fire, Did African Explorers Civilize Ancient Europe? The next time you feel like starting a blood feud, go to a classics lecture on any American campus or to any American publishing house and say the following: Egypt was a racially African civilization, and it conquered and civilized ancient Greece. As amply demonstrated by the growth industry in anti-Afrocentric publishing, North America's racially poisoned debates about nearly everything have made the discussion of the racial identity of a people from 6,000 years ago almost as vicious as the fight in Syria right now. Why the controversy? Because of what Martin Bernal, author of Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, described as the contest between the ancient model and the Aryan model of ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. The ancient Greeks made it clear that Egypt was their instructor and inspiration for nearly all aspects of their civilization. Europe believed this ancient testimony until the age of imperialism. At that point, it became morally and intellectually unfeasible to consider that those who were becoming the victims of the European Holocaust against Africa and the growing white world supremacy could be the grandfathers of European civilization itself. The racism necessary to justify those conquests was never defeated, not even after the Nazis were, who were inspired by the same racist historical revisionism. Enter Richard Poe, author of the controversial Black Spark, White Fire, a book whose trials of publication are almost as stunning as its revelations about the ancient world. So, Poe must be an angry African writer with an Afrocentric spear to sharpen, right? The kind who wants nothing more than to smear and destroy the European canon? Hardly. Poe is an award-winning, pro-gun, pro-capitalism, right-wing American journalist, part Russian Jewish, part Mexican, and best-selling author. So any notion that Poe is pandering to black radicalism couldn't be further from the truth. So is the idea that Poe cynically wrote the book to cash in on the Afrocentric movement. In fact, Poe had a hell of a fight to get his book in print. White editors and publishers he approached either didn't want a white writer to write the book or didn't want the book written at all. Some were upset or baffled by the notion of an African Egypt. One made bizarre reference to her fear that her mother might be mugged by black criminals, as if this were relevant to a civilization from thousands of years ago and thousands of kilometers away. Some academics didn't want to touch the issue. Some academics didn't even want to touch the issue. As Poe makes clear, established academics are sometimes professionally and even personally vicious enough to young mavericks to destroy their careers. Perhaps only a journalist, argues Poe, has the freedom to write such a book as his. Some freedom. Poe ended up forking over $30,000 of his own money to get the book researched, including the creation of artwork to display the forensic reconstruction of the face of an ancient Egyptian skull. And perhaps if famed Afrocentrist professor Dr. Molefi Keti Asante, head of Temple University's African Studies Department, hadn't written the introduction to this book, few Africans in the U.S. might have taken the book seriously. Neither white liberal nor black radical, Poe is also unlike many Afrocentric Egyptologists in that he doesn't regard the Greeks as mere historical plagiarists of greater, more ancient Egyptian genius. He is concerned neither with racial solidarity nor a political academic agenda. His sole concern seems to be the truth, hence his sacrifices. Highly accessible and jargon-free, Richard Poe's Black Spark White Fire is a dazzling voyage through the genealogy of human civilization, with forays into race, mysticism, science, philosophy, culture, and technology that one needn't be a specialist or a classicist in order to follow. I went far below the Pharaoh's chamber in the Grand Lodge of Imhotep Archives for today's conversation. Richard Poe spoke with me by telephone way back in April 2000. He discussed his reactions to the attacks against Afrocentric historiography by people such as Mary Lefkowitz, author of Not Out of Africa, the relevance of the classic text Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James, and why there's a pyramid on Greek soil, whom the ancient Greeks say is responsible for building it, and why most of us have never heard of it. We began by discussing the eternal relevance of history. And now on MF Galaxy, my conversation with Richard Poe. Richard Poe, you are the author of Black Spark White Fire, Did African Explorers Civilize Ancient Europe? And certainly the inquiry of your book takes us back to ancient Africa, in particular to ancient Egypt. Before we get into the controversial racial issues of this book, why should anybody in 21st century, highly technologized society care about what happened to a civilization that began 5,000 years ago?
For those of us who love history, we don't even need to ask the question. History is always important. But in general, I believe with Thucydides that we can't learn how to behave in the future if we don't know what happened in the past. The past is the memory of our race, of our kind. If we don't know what happened in the past, we really don't know anything. We're people without a memory. It would just be like a human being who has amnesia and doesn't remember what happened before today. How is he going to know what to do tomorrow? There are many lessons to be learned from the past, and in particular, in the case of my book, Black Spark, White Fire, there are lessons about the races of mankind and the relationships that they've had with each other over time, which have changed very drastically. We live in a time when, if you just look at a snapshot of the world, of course, we've seen in the last 400 or 500 years that the European race has been preeminent in the world and has been pretty much dominating everybody else militarily and economically. But if you go back further in time, you see that that's not the way it's always been. My book goes back to a time when Africa was really the preeminent power on land and sea, and in particular the nation of Egypt. And I think that most people today who go through a conventional education, I guess you learn about Egypt, but somehow the message isn't really drummed in that these were an African people and that these people lived so many thousands of years before the dawn of what we call the golden age of Greece, the golden age of Athens, when all the Greek philosophers appeared and all of that.
Maybe we could just, we'll return to that in a moment. First of all, just to clarify for the audience, you're certainly no Europe basher either, though.
Absolutely not. In fact, that's a point I make in my book. I am, of course, I would call myself a European American. I'm half Russian Jewish by descent and half Mexican, and certainly am, probably more European than anything else. But in addition to that, I'm definitely not one of these types who abound in academic settings, especially who who are, I guess you call them white liberals, people who are afflicted with white guilt and feel that they somehow have to atone for the sins of their ancestors by beating up on Europe and beating up on themselves. I'm just not inclined to be that sort of person by nature, and I don't people who would behave that way, frankly, I don't believe them anyway. I don't think they're sincere. I think a person who doesn't respect himself and his own heritage can't really respect anybody else's. That's a lot of people I don't think will agree with me, but that's my advice to everybody out there. Look out for those white liberals.
All right, well, we'll take that under advisement. Thank you. In North America's racially poisoned debates about just about everything, in some quarters, the racial identity of the ancient Egyptians is fought over almost as angrily as the soil of Kosovo. Now, roughly speaking, the furthest two extremes of the debate could be called the ultra-Afrocentric vision and the Aryan master version. What's the difference between the most extreme versions of the debate? And you're certainly not in either one of those extremes.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you refer to when you talk about the ultra-Afrocentrist position. The Aryanist position certainly is something I discuss in my book, which is really the mainstream position among European scholars back in the 19th century and even up through the 1930s in the 20th century. And that was the position that basically the white race of Europe was superior to all other races. In particular, that even the more light-complected a European you were, the more superior you were, so that under the Aryanist theory, a northern Northern European from Scandinavia, blonde and blue eyes, would be considered superior to a Southern European who was of a more swarthy complexion. And this theory, which of course people will recognize as having been adopted by the Nazis in the 20s and 30s and 40s, was really mainstream throughout the 19th century. But what a lot of people don't realize, and what I explore to some extent in Black Spark, White Fire, is that it's a relatively new idea. It wasn't something that people always thought. Really, it was just towards the end of the 18th century, as European power was felt around the world, and particularly as Northern European countries such as England and France gained the ascendancy, the idea grew up naturally that Northern European people were the most superior people. Now, before that, and go back to the texts of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, who of course are Mediterranean peoples, they had precisely the opposite notion, that they thought they, of course, were the most superior ones, and they saw the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, quote-unquote, Aryan types who lived up north as being quite barbaric, which in fact they were during that era. And they saw the African people who lived to the south as being extremely intelligent and sophisticated. And they discussed this gradation of mankind. Several of the different authors, Aristotle is one, Vitruvius is another, and they're quite consistent about it, where they say the Northern Europeans are barbarous, savage, stupid people, the Africans are intelligent, sophisticated people, and we, meaning the Mediterranean people right in between, they somehow imply that they have the best qualities of both. They're strong and warlike, but they're also intelligent, and therefore they're the best. So, in any case, the Aryanist position grew up as the Northern European people began to attain military and economic supremacy in the world. They created this theory to explain why they were so powerful, and it continued to be very popular in Europe right up until the Nazis basically discredited it. I say discredited, maybe that's not quite the right word to say. What happened is the Nazis
discredited it by accident, by losing, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess that's what it comes down to. Part of why I'm hesitating there is because I frankly don't believe the ideas of Aryanism have really disappeared at all. I think they're still very much with us, but what happened after World War II is they weren't considered respectable to talk about anymore. And, you couldn't express them in a university without having somebody accuse you of being a master race theorist or a neo-Nazi or whatever. So even if people continued believing these things privately, as I believe many do to this day, it was no longer politically correct to talk about it. Now, contrasting to that, of course, is the Afrocentrist position. I'm, again, not quite sure what you mean by
let me clarify. In your book, you're very clear to distinguish between academics like Dr. Molefi Asante, who has written the foreword to your book, and whose work you seem to admire and respect, and some scholars who describe themselves as Afrocentric, or some who are not scholars, writers who describe themselves as Afrocentric, who make claims that don't in any way hold up to scholarly inquiry. So I'm wondering what are some of the extremes that I want to make sure that the audience does not associate your Afrocentric vision of ancient Egypt with.
Right. Well, there are, as you say, many different types of Afrocentrists out there. There are people like Molefi Asante, who was very kind enough to write the foreword for my book, who is very well respected. And then there are others, such as Dr. Ben and, let's see.
Not Dr. Joseph Ben Jokinen, but the other Dr. Ben.
I didn't know there were two.
Yeah. So they're sometimes referred to as both as Dr. Ben, and one Dr. Joseph Ben Jokinen wrote books like Black Man on the Nile, and he's I believe he's Ethiopian by extraction, but he's an Ethiopian Jew.
Yeah, he is the one I was referring to, actually. This is news to me that there were two Dr. Bens. I thought he was the only one. I have to say I'm not I haven't read any of his books, but I'm just going by what scholars say. Scholars who are working in the field of Egyptology, they don't seem to like Dr. Ben very much. So that what you tend to find is there's a certain level of respect for Asante, there's a certain level of respect for Sheikh Anta Diop and some others, but then there seems to be some sort of attitude as far as Dr. Ben Yochanan and some others, and I'm just not coming up with the names.
So they're claims that they make that are, let's say, non-historical or mythical. What types of things are they saying about ancient Egypt or about African Egypt that don't make sense?
Well, I really want to stick with what I know rather than what other people say about other people, because I have to say one thing that I really discovered in researching Black Spark, White Fire, one book that I looked at very thoroughly was George G.M. James' Stolen Legacy. Now, part of the reason I examined that book so thoroughly is because he is usually considered to be one of the crazy, wild extremists.
And his book alleges that Greek philosophy, I think the subtitle even says, Greek philosophy was stolen from
ancient Egypt. And in fact, Mary Lefkowitz, who is probably the principal attacker of Afrocentric ideas, she wrote the book Not Out of Africa, she spends, I would say maybe two-thirds of her entire book rebutting various points that George G.M. James raised. So whatever you think of James, he's a very important author in the sense that the ideas that he put forth are very widely known and very widely attacked. And when I first read the book, I bought the book actually from one of these Muslim guys in the robes. I was walking down the street here in New York City.
Right, yes.
And it caught my eye, and I just bought it on the street. And I began reading the book, and I just couldn't put it down from the first page that I read. I just read from cover to cover in one day and was absolutely fascinated by it. It's a thoroughly engrossing and enthralling book. At the same time, as I was reading it, part of me was saying, gosh, this guy's kind of crazy, because the things he was saying seemed so extreme and so topsy-turvy, that he was basically saying that Greek philosophy itself had been completely adopted from the temple teachings of the ancient Egyptians, and he was saying that Freemasonry had existed during Greek times, and that it too was an Egyptian innovation, that the great Greek philosophers and scientists, he was saying, were actually initiates into the Masonic cult or the Masonic Brotherhood, which meant that they were initiates into a kind of global or international Egyptian religious order. And all of this I found absolutely fascinating, and I was intrigued by the fact that he clearly wasn't, even though what he was saying seemed kind of bizarre, clearly wasn't an ignorant man. He was somebody who really knew classical literature, and I later found out that he was actually a teacher of Greek at a college in Arkansas. So I was just intrigued by it, but I didn't quite know what to make of it. And then all this controversy hit over this book, Mary Lefkowitz just savaging the book and saying it's just all a lot of malarkey and so forth. But as I investigated each and every claim that he made, I found to my utter amazement that there was very little in that book that didn't seem to be very well founded. In many cases, I discovered documentation for certain claims that he made, which I don't even know if James himself was aware of. I suspect not. Somehow, just intuitively, he made leaps. He just put two and two together and made leaps of the imagination to make certain connections, which I don't think he realized could be documented. But when I did Black Spark, White Fire, I found documentation for them. And this was really amazing to me. And for that reason, I'm very cautious about criticizing other Afrocentric authors, because it's a very easy thing to do if they make a lot of claims that don't seem to be well-founded. But in my experience, when you look into many of these claims, you find that they're much better founded than you think.
Well put. I'm broadcasting from a province where calls are made for books to be censored when the callers for the censorship haven't actually read the book. So your remarks are refreshing here. To return to something you said a moment ago about Mary Lefkowitz and the number of people who have been bashing Dr. James's work, and of course he hasn't been with us for some time.
Right.
Why is it? Here's a book. I mean, it isn't even really well known, and it's certainly not to the public. Why is it that somebody like Lefkowitz in the 1990s has to take aim at this book, or maybe I should even say, what is it about Mary Lefkowitz and other scholars of her stature why are they so offended by this Afrocentric version or vision of history?
Well, the book actually has gotten around quite a bit among the sort of Afrocentric underground, and especially on the college campuses, which I think is where Mary Lefkowitz ran into it. She realized that in various black studies departments and so forth, this book was making the rounds. It was being assigned by professors in those departments. And I think the thing about this book that makes it so provocative is that it attacks the central myth or legend, if you will, of European superiority. And that legend is the legend of the so-called Greek miracle. When you look at the history of Europe, there actually is no history of Europe before the Greeks, and the Greeks emerged. Of course, the Mycenaean Greeks, whose writing we can sort of half-read, they were around, let's say, from 2000 BC onward. But the golden age of Greece that we're familiar with, when the so-called Greek miracle took place, we're talking about the 5th century BC. We're talking about, let's say, 450 BC, which is when Herodotus wrote his history. So this was the age that we think of as being the first great great flowering of European civilization. This was the age when all the great philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and so on, came to the fore, the great mathematicians, and the science, the literature, everything that we associate with Western civilization today was born during that time.
Now, why couldn't it have been a miracle appearing out of nowhere like manna or any of the Greek stories of Athena popping out of the head of Zeus?
Well, first of all, I think it was a miracle. I mean, as we noted before, I don't in any way denigrate what happened in Greece. I think it was a wonderful civilization, and there was much about it that was truly miraculous.
Perhaps I'm sorry, I should clarify. By miracle, I mean appearing without any explanation, without any predecessor. We associate much of 20th century advance, for instance, with everything that came before it. So isn't it possible that the Greeks could have just been so clever that they created this stuff entirely on their own?
Well, that is certainly what European scholars have always said, I shouldn't say always, but have said for the last 200 years or so. Who knows? Anything is possible, but what's interesting about the case of the Greeks is that the Greeks themselves did not claim to have sprung out of nowhere. This is where the basis of my book, Black Spark, White Fire, is really found. The Greeks had the legends that they had of the foundation of their civilization stated that they had learned the arts of civilization from Egyptians. They had a story that an Egyptian king named Danaus had sailed from Egypt at a very early time period, and that they had very specific details that he had sailed first to a place called Lindos on the island of Rhodes and erected a temple there, and then finally landed in the Peloponnese, the southern part of Greece, at a place called Abobothne, and disembarked there with his whole fleet, his whole army, and subsequently made himself ruler of all of Greece. His influence was so profound that the Greeks took on his name. They called themselves Danaans, after his name Danaus. And in fact, when you look at the very earliest writings of the Greeks, the writings of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Greeks are never called Greeks. They're never called Hellenes, which is the later name for the Greeks. They're called Danaans. They are named after Danaus. They're called the people of Danaus. That was what they called themselves. And in fact, in very early Egyptian texts that have been found, there is a nation called Dana, or something like that, DN. No one quite knows how to pronounce it. But this country does appear to refer to Greece. So this is a fascinating instance where archaeological textual evidence corresponds with legendary evidence, with a legendary story that's been handed down orally by word of mouth.
One thing that seems so fascinating, I'm shocked that the world doesn't know about it, and I was disappointed myself for having never heard of it before I got a hold of your book, and that was pyramids in Greece.
Yes, there are several pyramids in Greece. They're extremely mysterious. And there's a picture of one that I show in the book, a photograph of one near Argos. It's at a place called Elliniko. And I actually had the great pleasure of visiting this pyramid only after I wrote the book. My wife and I traveled to Greece, and the archaeologist Theodore Spiropoulos, the Greek archaeologist who's been studying these pyramids for many years, was kind enough to show us around, and he actually took us to the pyramid that's pictured in the book. And it's really quite a very large structure. This photograph doesn't do it justice. I don't know the exact dimensions, but it's really quite big. You can go inside of it. And it's about half of a pyramid. The top has been broken off, and there are a lot of stones tumbled around, but the bottom part is clearly that of a limestone, smooth-walled, four-sided, pyramidal structure, exactly of the sort that you would find in Egypt. And it doesn't correspond with anything that's known from classical Greek culture. The Greeks just didn't build things like this that we know of, not even the Mycenaean Greeks. And they date to a very, very early time period, a time when Greece was still thought to be extremely barbaric. And what's fascinating about these pyramids is that they're actually mentioned by some ancient Greek authors. There was a travel writer named Pausanias who lived in Roman times, who wrote what was essentially a tourist guidebook of Greece, and he visited this place, and he described this very pyramid, in fact, and he told the story that this pyramid had been erected as a monument to soldiers who had been killed in a great battle between Proetos and Acrisios, who were great-great-grandsons of Danaus, that same Egyptian king that I was telling you before. So if you stop and think for a minute, what we have here, we have a legend saying that an Egyptian king Danaus colonized Greece, that he sailed to Greece, essentially discovered Greece the way Columbus discovered America, colonized it, conquered it, gave his name to the people, called them Danaans, and then founded a royal dynasty an Egyptian royal dynasty on Greek soil, which went on for several generations, according again to the Greek legends. And according to those legends, two of his progeny, his great-great-grandsons, Acrisios and Proetos, built this pyramid. And right down to Roman times, Pausanias could travel there, and the local people still had these traditions and these stories saying this pyramid was built by this Egyptian dynasty, by the descendants of Danaus. At that time, too, and Pausanias also wrote about this, he visited the place called Abou-Bathmi, which is still there, and it was pointed out to me by Dr. Spiropoulos as we drove by on the Peloponnesian coast. This is the place where the Egyptians were said to have landed, and in Pausanias' time, it was a major tourist attraction, just as we Americans, in the States, will go to Plymouth Rock to see where the first pilgrims landed in 1620. The Greeks would go to this place at Abou-Bathmi to see where Danaus had landed, and they actually, in their traditions, had an exact date when he landed, which was 1511 BC. And this was recorded on the Parian marble, which is a stone that has a lot of legendary dates of different things that happened in Greek legend. And it actually says that the Egyptians landed in Greece in 1511 BC, which I think is really just amazing to even have an exact date for this thing.
Now, at this point, I'm sure a lot of listeners are saying, wait a minute, I've been to Greece, I've read books on Greece, I've seen pictures, I've certainly never seen any pyramids, and if there were any, everybody in the world would know about them. So why don't people know that there are pyramids in Greece?
Well, I'll tell you, I don't usually like to go in for conspiracy theories, if you will, but Dr. Spiropoulos himself, who is a very important archaeologist in Greece, will make no bones about it. He says that the establishment there in Greece does not want people knowing about these pyramids. They just simply out of nationalism, they don't like the idea of saying that people came from some other country in civilized Greece. It's just a stupid thing. It's a type of situation that comes up a lot in archaeology in various different countries, unfortunately, where certain artifacts, certain findings just aren't politically correct.
Well, I mean, I can see how somebody could hide a spearhead, but you do explain to some degree in your book how it is you could hide a whole pyramid.
Well, I'll tell you, it's an amazing thing. This pyramid in particular, I didn't realize how grandiose it was until we actually went there. It's on top of a very large hill, and when you go up there, you can look down on the entire plain of Argos. You can see the ocean, you can see the mountains, you can see the city of Argos. It overlooks the whole plain, and in ancient times that pyramid must have been just visible for miles. It was clearly placed on top of this hill to make it visible to this entire region. It's really a remarkable thing. But the thing is, there are so many ruins in Greece. There are so many old, ruins from not ancient times, Roman times, Turkish times, medieval times. They're all over the place. And in this particular region, in fact, Spiropoulos was showing me how the site was neglected. It was all overgrown. I mean, there was a little sign as you drove outside of Argos along this highway. There was a little sign saying the Elenico Pyramid is this way.
The following material is exclusive to the patrons-only extended edition of MF Galaxy. You'll hear Richard Poe discuss the Egyptian pharaohs named Senwosret, who had a huge impact on ancient Europe, the African colonists of Egyptian descent who settled around the Black Sea in ancient times, Richard Poe's take on the work of Martin Bernal, author of Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, a forensic reconstruction of a high-ranking ancient Egyptian named Natsef-Amun that casts light on his race, the extreme and often emotional resistance of Eurocentric academics to acknowledging the Africanity of ancient Egypt's population, the Afro-Asiatic language family that includes ancient Egyptian, Ethiopian languages, and Hebrew and Arabic, the extensive cultural similarities between ancient Egypt and other African civilizations, the publicity freeze-out against Black Spark White Fire, and the reaction of the Oprah Book Club against the book.
Outside of Argos, along this highway, there was a little sign saying the Elenico Pyramid is this way.
But so it's even called by the name pyramid.
Oh yes, they absolutely call it a pyramid, and it's marked on some tourist guides and things like that. But they really don't tell you anything about it. They just say it's been dated to I think it's 2600 BC or something like that. Nobody knows who built it or what it's doing there, and that's pretty much it. And it's really just treated as a not very interesting sidelight, and it's not taken care of. It's all overgrown with weeds, and there's no plaque there to explain to you anything about it. It's just kind of left there neglected, and the tour guides who come through just don't take people there. They take them to other sites. They take them to Mycenae, which is a great city nearby with all kinds of beehive tombs. They take them to, some interesting Byzantine churches that are in the area, but they don't take them to this pyramid. It's really a shame. I think part of it is, as Spiropoulos says, that the archaeological establishment there just doesn't like the pyramid. They don't like the story behind it. And with the tourist guide, I think they just don't really know what it is. They haven't been taught because this information is being kept very quiet. So it's an unfortunate thing because there are so many artifacts, so many ruins, so many points of interest in Greece that relate to these old stories about the Egyptian colonization that really could be presented to tourists as a fascinating thing. I mean, my wife and I sat in a cafe right on the very harbor on the island of Rhodes where Danaus landed before he went to Greece. It was his first stop from Egypt, but none of the tour guides could tell us that. None of them knew that story, and so here's this fascinating tale that has really been buried and lost. And I hope in some small way that by resurrecting it in Black Spark, White Fire, that someday people back in Greece are going to start relearning about these things and reacquiring their own history.
Just before we get there, you said that you and your wife had the chance to go inside the pyramid. I'm curious to know what's inside it. Is it a rubble core, or are there actual pyramid texts as one would find in Egypt?
Well, unfortunately, there are no texts. It's hollow, and, as I said, the top is broken off, so there are a lot of broken stones kind of lying inside of it. But it was a hollow structure. There was a door that you could go through, and the door is still there, and there are markings and incisions in it that suggest there was probably some kind of moving door that opened and closed, and it appears to have simply been perfectly hollow inside. If there were grave goods, treasures, any bodies, any sorts of things like that in the past, certainly they've been taken away long ago, which is typical of most ancient tombs.
In particular, pyramids.
Right. Spiropoulos does suspect very strongly that it was a tomb, that people were buried there. It probably did have very rich grave goods thousands of years ago, but they were probably stolen back in ancient times. Now there's nothing there. It's open to the sky, but you can go through the door and go inside of it. The thing that's remarkable about it is there are so many different types of structures all over the world that are called pyramids in Central America and so forth. And in Greece there are some other structures which I discussed in my book which are somewhat pyramidal. They have kind of a step structure that's kind of like a pyramid, but these structures near Argos are pyramids. They're not similar to pyramids, they're not like pyramids, they are absolutely in the form of smooth-sided, four-sided limestone pyramids, just like you see in Egypt, and that's really an unusual thing that ought to be studied more.
Remarkable that something so fascinating could have been kept a secret for such a long time. I'd like to ask you about some other explorers, as you refer to the subtitle of your book, some African explorers in ancient Europe. Let's talk about some of the personalities involved in this ancient exploration. You describe a king by the Egyptian name of I believe, Senusret, and of which apparently there was more than one, and known to us by the Greek name of Sesostris.
Yes.
And as a kind of a composite of a few different kings named Sesostris who had a very huge impact on ancient Europe, and they're associated, I believe, with the Black Sea and also with the Colchians. Could you talk about that?
Sure. This story was actually preserved by the Greek historian Herodotus, who traveled to a country that was then called Colchis on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. Now, this is the region today which would be the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, the Caucasus area. And it was very far on the very fringes of what you would call Europe today. But in that country, Herodotus claimed that the people were black, and he was very explicit in describing what he meant. He said that they had black skin and woolly hair.
That doesn't leave a lot to the imagination there.
Right. The people there told Herodotus that they were Egyptian in descent, in fact. They told him the story that an Egyptian army led by a pharaoh named Sesostris had once come through that area, and that the soldiers of his army had remained there as colonists and had been there ever since. And that's why they looked that way. Now, Herodotus also had traveled to Egypt and lived there for a long time and wrote extensively on Egypt, so he knew from first-hand observation what the Egyptians of that time looked like too. And so it's very significant that he made the observation that when he heard this story from the Colchians claiming to be of Egyptian descent, he believed them. And he said the reason he believes them is because, like the Egyptians, they have black skin and woolly hair. Now, this passage has become so controversial because Mary Lefkowitz and all these people who attack Afrocentrism all the time, they say, well, he didn't really mean black. He just meant kind of black.
Right.
He didn't mean really woolly. He just meant kind of curly, and they play these games, and for the layman who doesn't know the ancient language, it can get very, very confusing, and then they bring in Professor Snowden.
Frank Snowden, I believe, is quoted in your book quite a bit. Maybe you can tell our listeners about him.
Now, Frank Snowden is a great scholar. He's an African American and a very accomplished scholar of the Greek and Roman classics, and he's specialized in his career, his very long career. I think he's probably around 80 years old now. He wrote Blacks in Antiquity and Before Color Prejudice, wrote books about the status of black people during Greek and Roman times. And he's really an expert on the subject, very erudite scholar, very well respected, but he has this little quirk that he doesn't like to say the Egyptians were black. So the anti-Afrocentrists always trot him out to say this whenever the issue comes up, and he'll go on and on about how Herodotus didn't really mean woolly hair, he just meant curly hair, and he didn't mean black skin, he just meant dark skin, etc., etc., etc. But it's interesting when you talk to Dr. Snowden, and he helped me actually with the book, with some of the research. He was very helpful, but in the end he wasn't very pleased with it, because I revealed something in there that most people don't know, which is that when Snowden himself was interviewed by a scientific magazine, I forget which one it was, I think it might have just been called Science, but the reporter asked him point blank, he said, "Do you consider yourself to be black?" And Dr. Snowden didn't say yes. He said, "I don't consider myself to be anything." He said, "If I had to fill out something on the census, I'd fill out mixed." Dr. Snowden is rather light-complected. He does have features that you might describe as being more Caucasoid. He obviously is mixed, as most African Americans are to some extent. And as far as I'm concerned, he can call himself whatever he wants. He has every right to consider himself what he likes or to call himself what he likes. But I think it's interesting and revealing that here's this guy who for years has been held up as the authority of why the Egyptians are not black, and then all of a sudden you discover that he has a bit of a quirk when it comes to how you define who's black and who isn't. So maybe what Dr. Snowden means when he says the Egyptians aren't black is maybe he means the Egyptians are like him, and he doesn't think he's black.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I can't read his mind, but I just thought it was interesting that he said that. Most people, I think, don't know that that's his position on the subject. But in any case, to get back to Sesostris, this is what Herodotus said. And by the way, the point I make, about this black skin and woolly hair business is that all the arguments that are put forward really don't matter about what these words exactly meant to the Greeks, because the context in which Herodotus says them make very clear that he wasn't just saying these Colchians were olive-skinned and curly-haired like a Greek.
He was distinguishing them from Greeks.
Exactly. He was clearly saying that they looked not like a Greek, not like him, not like Mediterranean people that he knew and lived around, but on the contrary, like people in Egypt. So his meaning was unmistakable. And frankly, the fact that people argue about this, that grown men and women with PhDs argue about it, I find perfectly appalling, if I may make that observation. Anyway, these people were living in Colchis at that time, claiming to be descended from this Egyptian army, and Herodotus recounted the legend of Sesostris, which he heard from Egyptian priests in Egypt. And the legend basically was that this great pharaoh, many hundreds of years ago, had led an army out of Egypt, had conquered northward. There are different interpretations of how the route was, but the one that seems most obvious to me is that he went straight north into what is now Turkey and then into the Caucasus area. And then from the Caucasus area, he went all the way around the northern rim of the Black Sea, back towards west, back towards Europe, and down into what is now the Balkans area, the Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, those regions, and down into there. And he got as far as that before he then finally ran out of steam, so to speak, and withdrew back to Egypt with much treasure and so forth that he had taken. So it's interesting, the story has been there. Classicists who study Greek literature have always known about it, but for a long time it simply wasn't taken very seriously. And it's really only been brought back recently by a scholar named Martin Bernal, who is
the author of the Black Athena multi-volume set that has caused so much controversy.
Right, and Martin Bernal is a white scholar. He's from England, actually, Cornell University, and he's a professor of Near Eastern Studies there now. And he wrote, and is still writing, this epic work, Black Athena. He has 2 volumes out and is coming out with a 3rd sometime soon. And he looked at the story of Sesostris and pointed out that there was actually a great deal of archaeological evidence of all kinds, which suggested, it didn't exactly prove that this expedition had really happened, but it suggested that the story was actually plausible. It wasn't out of the question, as conventional archaeologists had always said. And I simply pointed out the work that Bernal had done and kind of left it open to the reader to decide yourself. I don't know how to judge if it really happened or not. I just think it's an intriguing mystery of ancient history that needs to be looked at more seriously than it's been looked at before.
To return to the 2 major controversies, one is the racial makeup, whatever the word race means, of ancient Egypt, and the other is the effects of ancient Egypt on ancient Europe. As far as the racial issue, certainly by quoting from Herodotus, you've established a very important piece of information about, at least racially speaking, how the Egyptians would be seen today by North American standards of race. Although I know that for some time, Herodotus has been a despised man in European letters, even being called, rather than the father of history, the father of lies.
Yes.
I mean, I suppose one of the reasons to attack him right now might be that he did claim that the Egyptians were Africans, but other than the words of Herodotus, your book does discuss a number of other issues that would establish the ancient Egyptians as an African people, and you touch on body types, linguistics, culture, and religion. Could you summarize some of that?
Sure. One of the most obvious things, of course, is appearance, and I'm very proud of the photograph that appears on the cover of Black Spark, White Fire. What that is the face of an actual Egyptian, which was taken from a mummy of a man named Natsef Amun. This man was a priest in the Temple of Amun in the city of Thebes, and he died around, I think, 1100 BC, during the classical era, if you will, of pharaonic Egypt. His mummy was subjected to a technique called forensic reconstruction. Now, if you look at some of the true crime shows on TV, you may have seen this technique used by police when they find, let's say, some bones buried someplace of a possible murder victim. They'll give it to a forensic artist who will reconstruct simply from the skull what the face of that person may have looked like in life. And many of these specialists are sufficiently skilled at this that they can construct a face that will be recognized by relatives and friends of the people who actually knew him in life. So they can get very, very close likenesses of what a person looked like. And this person, this Egyptian, Natsef Amun, was given to Richard Neve, who was a British forensic artist, probably one of the most accomplished and well-respected and famous such artists in the world. He's done many, many well-known reconstructions from all kinds of archaeological sites, and he did the reconstruction that appears on my book, and as you can see, the man has features that are clearly what anthropologists would call negroid. I spoke to Neve, I interviewed him, I actually met him when I was in England, and we talked at length about this project that he did, and he told me that he had really simply went by the bone structure, that in fact he was surprised to find what the face looked like, because he sort of had an idea of what Egyptians would have looked like, and it wasn't that.
So it wasn't that he had some kind of Afrocentric bone to pick, and that his own predetermined views had ended up shaping or moving where his hands went?
Absolutely not. He had just the opposite. He was predisposed, actually, to think that it would be a more Caucasoid-looking face, and in fact, using these measurements of flesh thickness that he used were Caucasian measurements. So he even made the face, not deliberately, but because those were the standard measurements he used, it probably looks even a bit more Caucasoid than it really did, the way he put it together. But he said that he simply treated the skull as if it were one more skull that the London police found lying in a ditch and gave him to examine, and he simply gave it the flesh that the bones seemed to demand, and this is the face he came up with. And there are other forensic reconstructions of Egyptian faces that appear in my book, some of them done by Neve, and some done by others, but virtually all of them show some degree of think of as recognizable Africanness. They're not all as, you get into this question of, what is quote-unquote Negroid and what is quote-unquote Caucasoid. And this becomes a problem, actually, because many so-called experts or anthropologists will try to tell you that the Egyptian people of ancient times were not quote-unquote Negroid. And what they mean is that they don't have...
They don't look like West Africans.
Yeah, they don't look like West Africans. They don't have the most pronounced form of, certain type of features, the prognathism, the jaw projecting, the thickness of the lips, even the texture of the hair often with the Egyptians was not as coarse or as woolly as you might find in West Africa. But you can see today, and actually it was very apparent in Professor Lewis Gates' Wonders of the African World. When he was in Nubia and in southern Egypt in those areas, he remarked on the variety of people that you could see there, and you could see it yourself that some of the people looked more Caucasoid than others in certain ways. Some of them had different textured hair than others, and there was really quite a great variety of people, but they were all people that you would describe as being black.
Yeah, I think what's really fascinating about this, you illustrate this in your book in part, that a double standard is present here, that if Europeans were only considered white if they looked like blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nordic people, then obviously a lot of Southern Europeans would somehow stop being white folks.
Right.
And similarly, perhaps because North Americans are most familiar with Africans from West Africa through the slave holocaust and other immigration, seem to discount the fact that Ethiopians and Somalians are obviously Africans, and they look a great deal like the ancient Egyptians depicted themselves.
Yes, they do, and the fact is, a Somalian or an Ethiopian or a Nubian walking down the street here in New York, nobody's going to say the guy isn't black. I mean, they would be considered black. There's no doubt about it. But in the anthropological world, they have this notion that they'll say, well, they're not really black because they don't have this particular nasal index or this particular degree of prognathism. They have these nitpicky little definitions of what is Negroid and what isn't. And so you end up excluding people who really are black. But the most outrageous instance of this, by the way, was a paper that was done by... all of a sudden I can't remember the man's name. I've blocked it out. But he's a very prominent anthropologist in Chicago, I think. And he came out with this paper that it gave every illusion of being the most state-of-the-art scientific study that had ever been done. He looked at all these skulls from all over Africa, and he entered their measurements into a computer, and the computer measured the degree of similarity that they had to different racial types. And he concluded absolutely from this study that the Egyptians were totally different from the West African types. And so everyone has used this study to show, look, here is scientific proof that the Egyptians were not African. But the problem, as I pointed out in Black Spark, White Fire, I discussed this man's work, and this was actually pointed out to me by an African-American anthropologist named Shamarka Keita, who had studied this. And he pointed out to me that when you look at the same study, he also said that the Nubians and the Somalians were not black.
By his reckoning, people who common sense dictate are Africans would suddenly mysteriously stop being Africans.
Exactly. So, and it's a game, now they have all of this terminology that they use of craniometry, measurements of the skulls, and now the DNA data is starting to be used in exactly the same kinds of ways. But all they're doing is interpreting it in a certain way so that they'll say, if we see this difference between this group and that group, that means they're two different races. But that's an arbitrary decision, and it's the same game that's been played since way before any of these technologies existed. When anthropology first emerged as a science 200 years ago, one of the very first things that they did was to look at the Egyptians and decide that they weren't black. And they did this even acknowledging that, well, the Egyptians kind of look black, and so do the Ethiopians and the Somalians and the Nubians and all them, but they're a different type of black.
It's quite fascinating, certainly for the number of people who are upset about this debate, and many of them who say that the claims of Afrocentrists are ahistorical. One of the things that makes them most upset is the implication that they are racist for making this denial about the Africanness of the ancient Egyptians, and yet it's the very energy that they apply to this denial that seems so out of place with the evidence.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't like to go around calling people racist because That's a serious thing to call somebody in these parts, but frankly, I can't think of any other reason why people behave that way. I think it's just really idiotic. And, when you confront people with these kinds of facts and they get so angry, and this is what I see again and again, the people, especially the academics, who just don't want to hear it, it's not just that they disagree with you, but they just get furiously, emotionally, heatedly upset. And I don't really know how to explain that in any other way except that they've got some issues there. They've got a real problem that they don't want the Egyptians to be black, period.
Now, I've taken a great deal of your time. I'm going to ask you if I could read or name a couple of things or a set of things in a list, and maybe you could give me the really short version of the significance of the given information to this debate. Okay, so the Afro-Asiatic language family. How does that connect the Egyptians to Africa?
Well, the Afro-Asiatic language family, Joseph Greenberg discovered in the 1950s. He's a very well-respected linguist. He classified all the languages of Africa, and he discovered that sometime around 6 to 12,000 BC, someplace around Somalia or Ethiopia, there was a language spoken there which he called Afro-Asiatic. That language then spread out all over Africa and then into Egypt. It spread north into Egypt, and out of Egypt spread out into Asia, which is why I call it Afro-Asiatic. There are literally hundreds of languages across tropical Africa to the Cameroons, to Nigeria, and all over that are related, that belong to this language family. The ancient Egyptian language belongs to this family, and the Semitic languages belong to this family, and that's where people get confused, because it used to be claimed that the Egyptians were Semites. That was one theory, because there were similarities between their language and Hebrew and Arabic and some of these other Semitic languages spoken in the Middle East.
But it's actually the reverse.
It's the reverse. Actually, Hebrew and Arabic and the other Semitic languages are African in origin. It's the other way around, and Egyptian resembles them because they came from the same source, which is Africa.
Culture and religion. You pointed out a number of fascinating cultural and religious similarities between northern Africa, specifically Egypt, and in the interior of the continent.
Well, there's a great deal of evidence. In fact, it's really the mainstream view today that the Egyptian culture, the Egyptian people, came into being in prehistoric times because of movement up from the south. People coming from the interior of Africa into Egypt, again, bringing this Afro-Asiatic language, but also bringing many cultural aspects. The type of artwork that's done can be shown to be very parallel to artwork the earth, the rituals associated with his coronation, many of the specific rites, such as shooting an arrow to the four corners of the earth, and so forth. Some of the symbols that he carries, the crook and the flail, the types of hats that he wears, the crowns. It just goes on and on. The Egyptian culture is so rich in imagery that can be found all over Africa. The similarities are profound, and it is extremely easy to find parallels within Africa for Egyptian culture, extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find parallels outside of Africa. The culture is unmistakably African, and that's been established ever since the 1930s, when certain anthropologists made note of that fact.
You also described something fascinating in your book. I'm sure to people who are well-versed in the classics, this isn't a shock, but this idea that the ancient world had a golden age of international contact, the Bronze Age. Sadly, it disintegrated because of a leap forward in technology. Could you tell us about that 1,000 or more years of history in a few seconds?
Sure. From about 3,000 to 1,200 BC, the primary metal that was used was bronze. It was the strongest, most easily worked metal that people knew about, and because of certain aspects of how bronze is made and where it's mined, the materials for it, copper and tin, a very large international industry grew up in which Egypt had a very big part. This created a great economic boom and a great incentive for people to sail very far from home looking for sources of tin so they could make bronze. And so during that time, we see archaeologically that Mediterranean area, including Egypt, was extremely wealthy. The legends that are still passed down by the Greeks and so forth of that time are of a very cosmopolitan, lively time of wealthy kings, a golden age. And this all came to an end when people discovered how to smelt iron, which could be found plentifully almost everywhere. It was no longer necessary or profitable to go sailing off to the ends of the earth to find iron. So this whole trade system collapsed. At that time, the power of Egypt also collapsed.
And that necessity to search so far and so wide had led, as you describe in the book, to the creation of guilds and even a religious cult among those explorers.
Yes, I make a case in my book that the cult of the Egyptian god Ptah, who was the god of craftsmen, among other things, this would have been the god who was responsible for metalworking, that this cult was spread throughout the Mediterranean world far beyond Egypt. And I'm not the only one who says this. There are many scholars who have ascertained that this is true. Plaques to Ptah have been found on sunken ships off the Turkish coasts. Texts from the Middle East have referred to the cult of Ptah as a cult that's very much alive in these Middle Eastern areas. And I make the contention that this cult, which had to do with craftsmen and with seamen also, with people who sailed the seas, that this was one of the driving forces behind this surge of exploration. I talk about an age of exploration that occurred during the Bronze Age when Egyptian mariners went out and discovered strange new lands, such as the lands of Europe and possibly even beyond. And they were driven by this cult, by this religion of Ptah, and I make what I think is a very strong case that this religion ultimately evolved into what we call Freemasonry today. Freemasonry has always claimed to be descended from the Egyptian temple cults, but in my book, Black Spark, White Fire, I think is probably the best documentation you'll find for plausibly demonstrating that that may really be true.
To wrap up, you've written an impressive book. You have condensed the work of a lot of scholars who would probably be very difficult for most folks in the general public to read through easily, specifically something like Black Athena, for instance, as well as combining that with a great deal of your own research and documentation. And you've, in literal terms, paid a very high price yourself, tens of thousands of dollars, to get the book researched, written, and published. And yet, despite all of that, despite the book's excellence, despite your personal sacrifices, it seemed like a number of people either didn't want this book written or they didn't want you to write it.
Well, yes, that's certainly true. When this concept actually didn't begin as a book, back in 1991, my wife and I, shortly after we were married, my wife is a filmmaker, and our first idea, Black Athena Volume 2 had just come out, and we wanted to make a documentary of Black Athena, basically. We contacted Martin Bernal, we got all these scholars on our board, we did all the right things, and we just could not raise the money. And time and again, we just heard the same old excuses. You're white, this has to be done by a black person.
And this was coming to you not from the black community?
No, this was coming from white people. I've never gotten any opposition at all from the black community. I've gotten nothing but the most welcoming attitude, the most positive attitude from the black community. Well, first these foundations, and then later when I decided to do it as a book, then going to literary agents and publishers and trying to get an advance to do the book, and there was just no interest whatsoever. And one literary agent actually said to me, she got very angry when I proposed it to her, and she started going on and on about how her mother lives in a black neighborhood and she's in fear for her life every time she goes to the grocery store and this and that. And I could understand her, you know, her feelings and her concern. She has an attitude because, you know, she feels some black criminal is going to kill her mother someday. Sure, but that's another issue. And to get that mixed up with, you know, wanting to explore some aspect of ancient history, I think is really getting your priorities mixed up. It shows how people aren't often trying to find the truth about history. They're just trying to work out their own angers and frustrations about things that are happening right now. And you just run into a lot of that kind of thing. To this day, we still have not raised money for the film, and what we're planning to do now is to put it on the internet, which we think we may be able to do more economically out of our own pockets. Who knows, maybe it'll reach more people that way.
This is a fine book. Even the story of how you came to write the book itself could make a film, let alone the actual content. Why hasn't the book sold better? It seems like it would make a terrific volume for a lot of university classes.
Well, you know, books are funny things. I certainly would have been very pleased to have it appear on the New York Times bestseller list.
Which you've done before.
Yes, with other books on other subjects. But, you know, I think that the book is simply, it really hasn't gotten any publicity. You know, that's the big thing. It hasn't gotten media publicity except on radio stations, radio shows like your own. And I think the word is getting out slowly but surely through word of mouth. I know within a very short time I was hearing a lot of positive feedback from very prominent people in the Afrocentric community. People were saying they heard Leonard Jeffries talking about the book on the radio, and friends of mine in Washington who were in the Black Studies community down there were saying everybody's talking about your book. So within a certain kind of academic circle, it got out there very quickly. But as far as getting out to the mass market, I think it's just a lot of people just don't know about the book, and I don't know what to do about that. You know, it's just a slow build. I'm not discouraged about it because a very similar thing happened with Black Athena, where the book was really a slow build as the word slowly got out, and my book seems to be following a similar trajectory. Really, it could use a boost. It could use some publicity, you know, some major national TV coverage or something like that, or even, you know, some big controversy.
Somebody attacking you viciously.
Somebody attacking me, and I think that's part of the problem too. I was kind of hoping Mary Lefkowitz and Forrest would come after me, but they didn't, you know, and I think they know what they're doing. You know, Martin Bernal was telling me himself. He says the first stage is the ignore stage, and that's the first line of defense. They ignore it and hope it goes away, and then comes the discredit phase, when they begin attacking it and trying to undermine it. And I've gotten a little bit of that.
You make kind of a reference to this on your website, but what would it take for your book to end up as an Oprah book pick?
Well, I'm afraid Oprah has slammed the door definitively on this one.
Oh.
I sent this book to Oprah.
And slammed the door? Why?
Well, I shouldn't say Oprah herself, but her underlings. I'm sure it never got close to her. But, you know, she has a whole system there. Of course, everybody sends their books to Oprah because, you know, she has this book club. Once a month, she picks a book, and whatever book she picks becomes a wild bestseller. And she's the only person that I know, the only human being on the face of this planet who has that power. You know, that
she's the King Midas of publishing.
Yeah, exactly. And so Oprah is really the holy grail of publishing. You know, she has a certain type of book that she always pushes. They always seem to be books about women who are being abused or oppressed or something like that, and it seems to be a common theme every book that she picks.
Yeah.
And that's her thing, you know, that's what she's all about, and that's fine. But we just figured, let's just send her the book, what can we lose? And they sent the book back and said, we can't accept this book, it's our policy, we don't accept books.
They don't accept books.
Yeah, and I said, well, okay, well, then I sent it back again, and I said, okay, I understand you don't take unsolicited books to consider them for Oprah to read, because I'm sure they're inundated with zillions of books. So I sent it back very nicely. I said, just give it as a gift to Oprah. No, she doesn't have to read it. She doesn't have to consider it. I'm just giving it to her. Came back, Oprah doesn't accept gifts of books.
Well, very disappointing. Well, Richard Poe, author of Black Spark, White Fire, Did African Explorers Civilize Ancient Europe? Thank you very much for joining us to discuss your fascinating book, and we wish you the best of luck with turning it into a bestseller.
Thank you very much.
That was my conversation with Richard Poe, author of Black Spark, White Fire, Did African Explorers Civilize Ancient Europe? We spoke by telephone in April 2000. To buy his book, visit mfgalaxy.org for the link. You've been listening to MF Galaxy, your weekly webcast of writers on writing, pop culture, politics, and Afrocentricity. I'm Minister Faust, your host, and I produce this show at the Grand Lodge of Imhotep in Edmonton. Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com provides the music. To hear previous episodes of MF Galaxy, visit mfgalaxy.org and click on MF Galaxy Podcasts. To subscribe to the show for free using iTunes or Stitcher, use the subscribe links on the top right. And while you're there, please take our listener survey. If your community radio station would like to play MF Galaxy, email mfgalaxypodcast@gmail.com to arrange hi-fi downloads. To advertise your online or offline business, services, ebook, graphic novel, album, organization, or community action on the show, go to mfgalaxy.org and click the Sponsor MF Galaxy link at the right. To contact me about what you've heard, who you'd like to hear, or to offer leads, email mfgalaxypodcast@gmail.com. I read everything you send and respond as much as I can. I'm on Twitter at ministerfaust.com. And to check out all my novels, videos, and book trailers, visit ministerfaust.com. Coming up next episode.
The whole Aryan model is massive massaging for the white ego. It's much, much greater, larger scale. And therefore to say blacks are taking this, that the image of a pure white Greece, dismissing all the evidence against, is something that gives Northern Europeans enormous satisfaction and self-confidence.
That's Martin Bernal, author of Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization. He'll be my guest on the next episode of MF Galaxy. I'm Minister Faust, wishing you Nub, Woman, Eman.